Okay, so chapter 1 is Internet and Web Basics, and there's a lot of, well, interesting stuff in this chapter, and it hits it at a very high level, right? And so what I expect out of this chapter is that you're not worried about memorizing every single thing in this chapter. I want you to just kind of take it in and say, okay, this is a starting point. This is a good kind of umbrella information that covers a lot of the internet, right? And then focus on the end of the chapter, right, where the coding part is, right? Of course, you'll need to know it for the quiz. However, that's kind of how I want you to think of this chapter, is that there's a lot of information. Not a lot of it has to be memorized because it will come as you work in this environment. Or not. All right. Thought this would be working. Okay. So these are the outcomes for the chapter. We're not going to cover every single one of these in depth. Again, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to hit the high points so we can spend more time doing stuff as opposed to talking about stuff. All right, so in this chapter, you'll look at the evolution, where the internet came from, web standards, universal design, accessibility, really important, right? We learned that throughout the whole semester. As you're coding, you're learning these accessibility features and techniques, which is going to be nice. The use of the web, that is the ethical use of the web. Browsers and servers. So web browsers and servers, what are they? Protocols. What is a domain name? What's a URI? And then creating your first web page. Okay. So where did the internet come from? It did not come from space, but it seems like it's space when you're saving stuff someplace and you don't know where it goes, right? But where it started was around the 1960s is when the internet started, or the late 1960s. The early 1960s is when networking started, right? Where they were able to actually connect multiple independent computers together. And when you have more than one computer connected to each other, we call that a network. And when you have multiple networks connected, we call that the internet. Interconnected network of computers. Okay? So the first group to do that was called ARPANET. This was like a government agency. So the Advanced Research Project Agency, that's what that stands for. They created a network. A network. Right? Then later on, they said, if we can connect individual computers together, why can't we connect multiple networks together, right? So remember that graphic that you saw when we were covering that there were only like 3 or 4, right, networks around? That was the internet. Well, they then tried to connect with NSFNet, right? Another agency, right? Then they tried to connect their network with the other network, and bingo. They got it to work, which created an internet for us, right? So that was really the creation, was when these two groups were able to connect their networks and communicate together. Okay? Now, typically, prior to 1991, the only people, right, that had access to the internet was the government, of course, right? Educators and researchers. That's the only people that had access to the internet. Then, around 1991 is when they said, you know what, this should be available to everyone, right? That's when you started seeing pop-up of different companies called internet service providers. I don't know if you remember that or not. There are a few companies that go way back. How many of you heard of a company called CompuServe? Okay. AOL. Prodigy. Yeah, these were all, right, some of the first internet service providers that provided access to the internet. Okay? Yeah. So maybe you remember if you were in school at that time prior to 1991 that perhaps you were using the internet for maybe some of your classes. I don't know. Right? But it's possible. Because, again, academic use was very high. Right? Research was very high. People were posting things on the internet, and then schools were able to access that information, typically at the library and such. So that's basically where it came from. Now, I've provided a graph. Now, let's keep in mind that the full-blown version of this PowerPoint, right, has all the slides. My version does not, and I've actually changed some of the things to make it more current. Because if this book was produced 6 months ago, right, it's not going to have the most current charts and stuff. So what I try to do is I try to find the most current stuff and I try to integrate it. I hope that's okay. All right. So, all right, good. So this chart shows users of the internet in the whole world. So as you can see, with a very large majority of that, the users are coming from Asia. Almost 50%, right? That's a lot of users. How many users do you think? How many users do you think use the internet? There you go. 3 billion, right? 35,749,340 users at that time on 2014, quarter 2 of 2014. That's a lot. Think of that, right? And most of them are coming from Asia. U.S., where are we? North America, right, which is Canada and us. And that is right there, so 10%. All right. Web standards. So let's talk a little bit about web standards and the W3C consortium. Well, with the advent in 1991 that the public was able to use the internet, what did they start to do? Develop web pages. But everybody did it a different way. So some people did it one way, some people did it a different way. Browser manufacturers could care less the way you did it, and they're going to code the browser to display it the way they think it should be displayed. Wow. So we had different browser manufacturers that did things differently. Not good. Now, it's so much easier because most of the mainstream browsers say, yeah, let's have developers code one time and have it look the same on all the browsers. So what they did very early on was create a consortium, the W3C. You'll become very familiar with this website, right, and this consortium. They're the ones who essentially propose and recommend everything that happens on the web. So the HTML5 recommendations, the ones we're going to learn in this class, they came up with them. And they hope that the browser manufacturers say, yeah, I like that recommendation, and they integrate it in their browser. Most do now. Before, in the olden days, they didn't do that. Okay? Yep. So web accessibility. Very important. If your website or company gets any sort of government funding, you are required, that is required, right, to have accessible material. Not only physically accessible, right, you need ramps, you need elevators, things like that, but you also need an accessible website, right? So the Section 508, right, is the government's version of that accessibility guidelines. Now, the W3C, let me go back a slide, they have their own web accessibility initiative. They're very similar, right, but just a little different. In this class, we're going to learn the WAI, so the W3C's version of accessibility, okay? That's what we're going to learn in this class. Great. All right, let's see here. Network overview. This is basically what a network looks like. I would say this is fairly close to what a company's network looks like. Your home network is probably going to be something like this. An internet service provider, perhaps Comcast or SBC or AT&T, some internet service provider. Now, maybe you don't even have one at your home, but you have it because of your phone. Maybe that is your internet service provider. Not sure. But access to the internet, you most likely have a router, and these days, what's pretty popular? A wireless router, right? Nothing you have to actually plug into other than the thing coming from your wall from the company who's providing you with internet service. So you probably have a router, then you probably have a computer or personal computer. Typically, at home, we don't call them workstations. We just simply, they're my personal computer. Whether they're a Mac or they're Windows, they're a personal computer. Laptop, tablet, whatever it is. Then you might actually have a printer, right? That'd be nice. Whether that printer is connected to the network or connected directly to your computer, right? That's up to you, and up to your what you want to do. So this is basically what we're seeing here. But in a company, this is basically what we see. Internet, a router, a switch, a server, which is where the websites are housed, where the databases are located, where a lot of things happen for the company and that are stored. And these, right, devices access the server for information. Okay. So this would be considered a network. Then this network communicates with other networks on the internet, which then, right, is the internet. Networks communicating with other networks. All right, the client-server model. What I wanted to point out here is that you, as web developers and web surfers, use this model when communicating with the internet. Right? So you're the client, you are the user, the client. You're on some sort of device, PC, laptop, right? And to communicate with the internet, you're using what type of application? What is it called? It starts with a B. A browser, right? A internet browser or web browser. We typically call them by their name, don't we? Oh, I'm using Chrome, or I'm using Firefox, or I'm using IE. Well, those are all just browsers, right? Companies that develop these things that allow us to surf the web, okay? So you're considered the client, and your browser is considered the client. So your computer and then your browser is the one that actually does the initial communication with the internet. Now, the internet really is this web server that contains all that information. So your web server right here has all of the web pages you're requesting. Okay? Now, this graphic doesn't really show everything that's going on right here in these blue arrows. There's a lot of stuff happening between there. You may not have a direct from your computer to the server. It may have to go from one server to another server to another server, then to your final destination, right? But this is basically the idea, is that your browser communicates with the internet and then to a web server. That web server then replies back and then gives you the information on your device, right? Whether it's a laptop, tablet, phone, or PC. Sound good? Any questions? All right. So what is a internet protocol? What would you say is something that would be similar to an internet protocol? Communication, how about a language? Let's say protocol is similar to the word language, a language, right? It's a set of rules and guidelines that says how I communicate, right, over the internet. So it's really just like learning a new language. So if we want to speak English to each other, we need to understand the rules of English, or the rules of Spanish, or the rules of Chinese, or the rules of, right, any other language. Okay? And these are all made up in what are called protocols. Okay? But what's important to know here is that the internet is not made up of one language. It's made up of many languages, just like us here, right? We're the melting pot, as they say. A lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages, and we all work together. That's the internet, right? So, no single protocol that makes the internet and the web work. Okay? It's a series and a different protocols that function as needed, when needed, to get the communication from here to there. Okay? Now, what are some of those protocols? I have them here at the bottom. We have something called FTP. There are many of them, but I'm just giving you a few. FTP, File Transfer Protocol. This is the language that allows for files to be sent from one device to another. Okay? Email. There's actually a couple or a few different languages, protocols, that communicate mail for mail purposes. SMTP, POP3, and IMAP. Okay? Some are newer than others, but these are the three that are out there. And then this one you're really familiar with. I know you are. HTTP. Every time you surf the web, you're most likely using HTTP. How many of you know that you are? How do you know you are? It tells you that you are. And where does it tell you that you're using HTTP? All right. Picture a browser in your mind. Picture what we call the address bar at the top that says what at the left-hand side? http://www, blah, 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 right? Okay. You are using HTTP to communicate, right, when you're looking for web pages. Okay. So you've been using that the whole time. Okay. Now, this little graphic called a packet structure, everything is sent in packets. Okay. A packet has one piece of information. That information is called data. Okay. It's in ones and zeros, by the way. So the internet, it's all about numbers. Those numbers are made up of ones and zeros. Right? 1 on, 0 off. And so that collection of ones and zeros then get collected and put together on the other end. So this is a packet structure that has data and a little portion at the beginning called a header, which has information about where it came from, where it's going, and to make sure that the information being sent is the information being received. It's called a checksum. Okay? Not to be confused with dim sum, but checksum. Sound good? All right, very good. Again, this kind of stuff, I wouldn't worry about it, right? You're going to start to learn these things. And this is really part of networking as opposed to web development, right? So here's your HTTP request. Similar to one of the other slides where we talked about your client and server model, right? Web browser and web server. Your browser is making an HTTP request to a server. That server responds with what? The web page, right? That information. So the pictures you see, the video you see, the text you see, just think about it for a moment. All of that went across the internet in ones and zeros. Then came to your computer and got reassembled to look nice for it to display in your browser. And that happened in like what, a millisecond? That's crazy. As we think about that, how fast things happen. Right? So that's basically what HTTP is. It allows us to transfer, right? Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It transfers, right, our request and information from the browser to the server. Now, we have to talk about IP address when we're talking about web servers and HTTP and Internet Protocol. Right? An IP address essentially is the location of a particular resource that's on the web. Every single device that connects to the internet has an IP address, whether you like it or not. Okay? That's right. Now, the previous version of IP is IP4. They're now on IP6, version 6. It's much larger. So I don't know if you've ever heard in the news a little while back, oh, they're running out of IP addresses. The internet is running out of IP addresses. Okay? So this is an IP address. The shortcut term is called the dotted quad. Okay? Quad is in 4. Very good. Yep. So the dotted quad, 1, 2, 3, 4, quad for 4, and then the dots in between. Okay? So it's just a shortcut name for an IP address. So if you were to type this IP address, you would actually go to Google. Remember, the internet works on numbers. That's all they understand. We, as humans, understand words better than we do numbers. Okay? For a moment, how many websites could you rattle off that you know by heart? Google, this or that, right? How many do you think? A lot, right? Because they're words. But think about that same number if you had to remember 4 groupings for each one. No way, right? Yeah. At least, I don't think I can. If If you can, fantastic, but I know I can't. So what an IP address does, because the internet communicates with numbers, the IP address provides a number, which the internet understands, to what we call a domain name. That's this right here, and that's our next slide. The domain name is a word, right, to the IP address. They connect. So if you want a domain name, a website, because not all IP addresses are websites. Your laptop has an IP address. It doesn't mean it needs a domain name, but IP addresses are associated with websites. So if I want to go to a website, I don't write this in, although I could. I write Google because it's that much easier. Yes. The number, exactly, right? Since it's easier to remember somebody's name than it is to remember perhaps every phone number of every friend that you have, right? Yeah. Very good. Now, could we write the IP address in? Absolutely, right? If you know it. In fact, you'll get to the website faster than if you were typing the name. How much faster? Probably like 100 milliseconds faster. Yeah. It's not fast enough to see a difference. So you really don't do this. Right? You do this. So you write in the domain name, not the IP. Now, how does it work? How does it know that when I type in Google that it should go to that domain name or that IP address? Because of something called a DNS, a domain name system. The system has a list of places you've looked for before and their IP address. So if you've gone to Google at least once, it creates a table. It says Google equals this IP address. Now, if the place you want to go does not have, right, so you don't have, let's say, jcpenney's.com in your table of places you've gone before, then what does it do? Sorry, I don't know where to go. No. It requests the information from another computer. It says, hey, computer down the road, can you look at your DNS table, and is there something in there that can help me find jcpenney's.com? And they'll say yes or no. If it's yes, great. They provide the information, and boom, and off you go. If they don't, they say, I don't, but I think I know who does, right? Keep going down the street and you'll find that server, and they, I think, know where jcpenney's.com is. And once they find where it is located, right, it responds back, and then it sends, right, the message to jcpenney's.com. Right? So it's always communicating, and the DNS system provides that, right, that flexibility where I don't have to know exactly where it's located. I just have to say I'm looking for it. Okay. Any questions so far? How are we doing? How's the pace? By the way, I believe this chapter has the most slides that I cover. All the other ones are a little bit less. I think this one has 20. The other ones have like 10, maybe 12. Just FYI, in case you're starting to get bored. I'm not, but maybe you are. I don't know. Okay. TLD. Tender loving domain. Top level domain name. A TLD, top level domain name. What this is the rightmost portion of a domain name. Google.com, right? Whitehouse.gov. So it's these portions, right, that a top level domain is. And so when you are looking for a website domain name for your company, right, let's call it ABC Company for now, you're going to be looking for some top-level domains, abccompany.com, abccompany.net, abccompany.org, if you want that domain name, right, if you want that top-level domain. You can register for more than one. Some companies have cornered the market on their particular domain name, what we call a second-level domain. So Google.com, Google.net, Google.this, Google.that, right? So this way, no matter what you type in, you're going to Google, right? But that costs money, okay? And in some cases, you can't because there's regulations. For example, .mil, .gov, .edu for sure have requirements that you either have to be part of the military, part of the government, or an educational institution to actually have a .edu, .gov, right, top-level domain. So some you cannot register, others you can. Okay. Does that make sense? All right, fantastic. And there's some other ones, and there's always more. I mean, they just recently came out with some other ones that are somewhat larger. I mean, the idea behind top-level domains is to organize the web easier, right? So anything that's supposed to be a non-for-profit should be using a .org. But a lot of companies that are not non-for-profit have .org, right? If you're in the aerospace industry, you should be using .aero, right? If you're, a business, supposedly, you should be using .biz. If you're a company that, something like Monster, you should be using .jobs, right? But that's not always the case because which is the most popular? .com. And it's ingrained in our brain. I think now newborns already know that .com is the most popular, okay? We don't say anything else, right? The .com bubble, .com, this .com, that .com. And now maybe we've even left off the .com because it's an assumption, right? Google, hey, go to Google. You don't say Google.com. You don't say Sears.com. You don't say, whatever.com. You just say the domain name. All right. There are many new top-level domains or generic top-level domains. So I'm just going to use this link here, and we'll take a little detour of some of those domain names that are out there now and when they've come out or when they will be available. Now, you're going to see this one right here. Look at this. Toyota. That's right. .Toyota, the one that's right, makes the cars and whatever else they do. So what they did is they paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to be able to have their own TLD. That's right. So typically big companies are going to create their own. Here. Okay. Nokia. So now it's not .com anymore, it's .Nokia, if that's what they want. Okay. Another way for this group, right, ICANN, to make more money and to organize the web, supposedly. All right, so that's just a sample. Just a link. And those, I believe those links are in the full-blown version of the key concepts. Now, there are also country codes. You probably saw them in a previous slide. Let's go back for a moment. Right there. Asia, right? So that's one of them. So here, you'll see that these country codes are the codes for each country. Every country has one. We have one too, but we don't use it. It's understood. Okay? It's .us. How many of you been to a website? .co.uk. Right? Yeah, that's United Kingdom. So there are lots of these. IT for Italy, SP for Spain, okay? JP, Japan, UK, right? Australia. So they not only are there, right, these top-level domains that organize the web for us based on industry, but there's also country codes as well. So this is essentially how a domain name system works. I generally gave you the idea already, but let's review a bit. You're in your web browser and you make a request. Your computer does not know where it is, so it has to go ask the domain name system, right? So it says, I need information. Nope, I don't have that. Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll go and find it. Once we found it, it sends the information back to the browser. The browser then sends a request to where it needs to go, and then the server responds back with the web page. All that is happening in milliseconds. Pretty amazing stuff. All right. What is a markup language? A markup language. So a markup language essentially is a set of guidelines, right? A language that allows for structure and formatting. Now, HTML came from something called SGML, which is simply a framework, okay? Not necessarily a language. It's a framework that they used to develop HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, which you'll be learning in its 5th iteration, right, in this class, as well as CSS in its 3rd iteration in this class. So HTML5, CSS3. Okay? So basically, a series of codes that allow us to make things look a certain way and be positioned in a certain way. Okay. Great. We sometimes call them elements or tags. Elements or tags. And you learn this in the end of the chapter where you actually code. So you're learning HTML5, as I indicated, right? W3.org, which is the W3C.org, is going to be your friend. You'll be going there a lot to make sure what you coded actually is coded correctly. Okay? That is that you've coded it with you've crossed the T's and dotted the I's. Doesn't mean it looks nice in your browser. It just means that you crossed your T's and dotted your I's. So the most current version is HTML5. Again, it has not been approved yet by the WC3, but everybody's using it, right? Everybody's, all the browsers are coding for it. Right? It's one of those things you can tell your mom. Everybody's doing it, and it's okay. All right, it is a mix of HTML4 and XHTML1. We take those together, we create one version called HTML5. And here is a sample of what your first web page is going to look like. What you will create for your practice, that is the basis. This is what your code will look like, and this is the base of every single page you will create in this course. And you learn it in this chapter. So every web page, every HTML web page has a doc type. It has an element called HTML. It has an element called head. It has an element called title. There are meta tags, and then there's one called body. The minimum is doc, HTML, head, and body. Those are the minimums, and without that, you don't have an HTML page. And as we move on throughout this course, we will be adding things to this in addition to the baseline. Right? This is our basis right here. Everything else gets added on. Okay? So as I mentioned in orientation, yeah, we work every chapter, we add on to what is assumed you've learned in the chapter prior. So in this chapter, you're learning the structure, the basic structure of every single HTML page. In chapter 2, I'm going to expect we're going to be filling in some of this stuff right here. So things that go inside the body is what we're going to be learning to do in chapter 2. And in chapter 3, we're going to be taking what we learned in chapter 2, which we already learned in chapter 1, right, and moving forward. Now, if we don't have enough time, because it's already 11:22 on the clock, we will then finish, of course, the rest of the items on the agenda on Thursday. Okay. But what I wanted to point out here is the structure of your basic code that you will need every single time we create a page in this course. I guarantee probably by chapter 3, maybe even chapter 2, you will have had this memorized. Not because you're trying to memorize it, it's because you just do it enough times that it just now starts to come. And if it's not, it's okay. Because I'm not asking you to memorize it. I'm looking for you to know where to find the information. That's what web development is all about, right? When you do it enough times, it just gets in your head automatically. But if you don't know something, you just need to know where to find the information. That is crucial. You don't have to have everything memorized. You just need to know where to find the information so you can get done what you need. Right? What's up here? Absolutely. It's like a coding language. And it uses these types of symbols, right, to indicate opening and closing of these, what we call tags. We like to call this a tagging language. Okay? Not tagging like you do on your Facebook page or LinkedIn or some other social network. But these tags are essentially words that mean something to the browser, right, and that are important. And then we indicate when they start and when they should close. Notice how some of them have two, head and head, but notice the difference. This one only has one, right? Meta, that's it. There is no closing one like this one has. Title and title. Right? Notice this one only has one. There is no closing one down here that says doc type. This is a singular, right, or non-paired. These are paired. If they have two with the same word, it's considered paired. If there's only one, it's not paired. Any questions? What do you think so far? Good? Hope not much of it was boring. But there's a lot of information, and it is all very good. All right, let's see what we got next. And that may be it. And that's it for the chapter. In an abbreviated summary. The full key concepts have many more slides. I narrowed it down to what I thought was important. Any questions? I agree. I have 11:25.